So what we saw post-Brexit, and particularly with the status of Gibraltar moving with the UK effectively outside of the European Union, and a lot of the big UK-facing online gambling operators having established themselves historically in Gibraltar, it did force them to reconsider where they needed to set up their operating hubs in order to continue supplying their services, both in the UK, but more pertinently throughout the European Union and indeed elsewhere.
Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of the SiGMA podcast, where today we're meeting Chris Elliott, a partner at Wiggin, a law firm in the UK with its offices in London. Good afternoon, Chris, and thank you for accepting our invite.
It's my pleasure. Good to talk.
It's a pleasure to host you. And it's a pleasure to spend the next 20-25 minutes chatting with you about regulatory compliance, in particular with the UK market. The UK market, which has been in the news again last week, following the fine which Gamesys has received, a record fine of 6 million sterling. And actually the wording used was not a negotiated settlement or that sort of thing. It actually was listed as a penalty on the UKGC website. I don't know if they are clients of yours or not, but whatever, as a lawyer, you could tell us, as a lawyer with an interest in the UK market, what happened there? And should we be expecting more of these big fines in the UK?
So I think what the regulator here has pursued, as we all know, an enforcement-led strategy for a number of years now, which has seen, increasing fines levied against many of the largest operators and indeed many of the sort of mid-tier operators as well. There are fewer and fewer operators that haven't had some sort of enforcement action brought against them, whether it be concluded by way of a settlement or indeed, in this case, as a financial penalty. And so it should come as no surprise that there are more examples of this coming, and actually the numbers that you see off the back of them may well get larger. You've seen some very significant financial penalties or indeed settlements reached during the course of last year, and there are known to be obviously ongoing enforcement processes as well. What the regulator has said, and this may be reflected in some of the more recent ones that you may have seen in the press, is it's made a real point of saying that particularly where there is seen to be repeat offenders, so people who have been through enforcement processes once before or twice before, the extent to which issues which are occurring are similar or equivalent to those which have been raised in the past, that will be seen as a significant sort of aggravating factor, and so may result in the imposition of a larger penalty than might otherwise be the case.
Okay, so repeat offenders, basically, there's sort of recidivists, and you get
Yeah, I think that's right, and there's obviously some logic and coherence to that as a strategy. It obviously doesn't want to somehow seem to be sanctioning these sorts of penalties as a cost of doing business. To the extent that you are a repeat offender, it will cost you more money, as it were. In terms of the sort of contrast between penalties and settlements, again, we have seen in the past the Commission be less inclined to reach a settlement with an operator that has been through an enforcement process before. There's not always consistency in that approach, because obviously we've seen some businesses that have been through multiple enforcement processes capable of reaching a settlement. But nevertheless, we have seen the Commission sort of not default as quickly to settlement as a potential outcome. Now, of course, there can be any number of reasons why settlement doesn't work for an operator as well, and particularly where, for example, as we're seeing more examples of, where an operator may not feel as able to sort of concede that actually there have been breaches. One of the conditions of settlement by its sort of nature is that operators are concluding, and the Commission is concluding, enforcement action on terms which are agreed between the parties. And of course, if the parties are not agreed on what breaches have occurred, then that may well rule out the opportunity to resolve an enforcement action by way of a settlement. So that's obviously one factor to bear in mind. But yeah, so we have seen, I think what is probably fair to say is there's probably like to be more examples of financial penalties being levied than perhaps has been the case in the past for some of the reasons I've mentioned. Yeah.
So basically you have the UKGC, which is now going to be, let's say, a little less tolerant with repeat offenders then.
I think that is fair to say. It doesn't take a huge leap to do that. So where it is the case there's a repeat offence, then yes, it will be dealt with in sort of perhaps sterner terms than might otherwise be the case. What I would say is, as much as we've seen an enforcement-led approach, I mean, you've seen in even Andrew Rhodes's recent statements, but sort of more widely at the Commission as well. I do think we're sort of moving into an era where it's the default to enforcement to drive compliance improvements may well not be as that decision to go into enforcement may not be as readily made. I think there's definitely a shift in the sort of tone coming out of the Gambling Commission in the UK to say actually it's more prepared.
In what sense? Change in tone?
Well, I think there's recognition. I think that actually some of the more egregious breaches that you've seen in the facts of in past or historic enforcement actions isn't really apparent in more recent compliance assessments, which are often the origin of enforcement action. I think the Commission has noticed that there has been a shift in the market, and particularly amongst the largest operators, to really sort of de-risk their customer bases, and particularly in respect of those that are likely to be examined during an assessment. So your higher value customers more often now will actually have had significant eyes on and sort of risk assessments done with respect to that relationship than perhaps might not have been the case in the past. You're also seeing far fewer examples of, one of the key features of lots of recent enforcement is this sort of speed of spend issue, the ability for customers to register, deposit and gamble very significant sums in short periods of times. But before systems are capable of reacting to that, I think what has happened is that the industry has sort of recognized that and actually shifted towards not letting that sort of thing happening. And I think you are seeing an acknowledgement from the Gambling Commission that the industry has reacted in a way that it considers to be kind of appropriate. And therefore, that you will find more examples now, I think, of the Commission, even where issues are identified, because of course they always are, that it may well not feel the need to go to enforcement to drive the changes. It may well sort of trust the industry or those operators that are currently being examined to sort of make improvements outside the scope of an enforcement process. And we're certainly seeing that in the sort of casework that we're involved with.
Should we expect the UKGC to also step up its periodic audits for its operators, for its licensees? Have they increased their headcount? Have they increased their resources in order to keep up with the number of licensees? But I would imagine now there needs to be a number of repeat audits, especially with those who possibly have negotiated settlements the first time round.
Yeah, I think look, the resourcing at the regulator has always been a sort of question for them, as to particularly in pursuit of this enforcement-led strategy. I think there's always been a bit of a perception that there's a sort of backlog in the number of enforcement cases or a number of compliance assessments that we're conducting at any one time, and the regulator, perhaps even more than the industry, suffers from sort of a turnover in its staff, and it's well known that members of its compliance and enforcement teams have moved on often quite quickly. And so it does.
When you say they move on, they actually move on to operators.
Well, they can do in some cases, yes. So or move outside the industry altogether. So it does deal with that resourcing demand. But my experience is, the Commission are still, very active and busy undertaking these types of assessments, and you can sort of see themes in how it is that they're approaching the task and who it is that they're particularly focusing on. I mean, the large operators, the Commission, again, this is its public position, because of their market share and their impact on the market. They would attract more attention than perhaps ones with a smaller customer base or that have a sort of slightly lower risk profile. And similarly, to the extent that you have been involved in enforcement action or in sort of similar enhanced compliance processes where the Commission perceives your processes perhaps to present more risk to consumers than others that are more compliant, you will receive more attention. So you can expect to have more frequent assessments undertaken of your business than might be the case for some that are perceived to present lower risk. So, they adopt a risk-based approach as to how frequently they're going to get an eyes on businesses, which again I think makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay. There have been a number of consultation documents issued by the GC these past few months. Maybe you could run us through what has been published, how the processes are going on, and what should we expect?
Look, I mean, and there's been a number of consultations following the publication of the white paper last year. I mean,
okay, when you talk about white paper, for the benefit of our viewers, white paper on?
So the white paper was a government issued paper publishing its view as to what the future of gambling regulation should be in Britain going forward. It was much delayed. It's been spoken about for a long time, but it published effectively a whole-scale review of how the market's performing, but also how it is that the government sees gambling regulation needs to change to address some of the risks presented since the last time it was able to undertake that sort of review. You know, there's been very significant technological developments that have fundamentally shifted both the product, but also the way in which customers and consumers actually use the product as well. So it has a wide-ranging series of kind of key proposals, much of which has been debated at length, both prior to it and since, but are now in the course of being implemented largely through the course of Gambling Commission consultations. And by that, it means changes to gambling regulation rather than changes to primary law. There are actually relatively few of the proposals that require legislative change. And so what the Gambling Commission has been busy doing is, trying to give effect to the government mandated white paper proposals by consulting the industry as it's required to do, to propose its view and its vision as to what the government actually intended to achieve. So some of the key consultations that are ongoing include things like, as much spoken about, consultation to introduce things like financial vulnerability and financial risk checks, which has recently been consulted on and closed, and that we're waiting to see the outcome of. That proposes, as I think many of your audience will know, a mandated requirement that operators must conduct certain types of financial risk checks, or what are called financial vulnerability checks or financial risk assessments, at predetermined financial loss thresholds. So again, that's been lots spoken for players. Yeah, that's been much spoken about and debated both in the press and even amongst government officials in the industry as to what that's actually going to mean and how it's actually going to be implemented. And it has some really quite thorny sort of challenges still associated with it, and some sort of still unanswered questions about how that's actually going to work in practice. So there's a whole suite of sort of ongoing consultations to give effect to things like that at the moment. So it's all changed.
So I need to ask, with the possibility of very strong likelihood now, because according to the poll I saw earlier this week, the indications are there will be a change of government in the coming months in the UK. Has the Labour Party given any has it made aware to the public its position on gaming? Or right now, is it an issue which is better kept on their wraps because it doesn't win you any votes?
There are certainly some very vocal politicians within the Labour Party that campaign for gambling reform in much the same way that politicians do within the government.
In what sense? In which direction do they want reform?
There's some Labour ministers are very active in proposing, let's say, more sort of radical reform as far as what, let's say, financial risk checks, that these should be mandated at lower levels and much more onerous, certainly as it would impact the industry, because they're driving for, it's understandable. They're driving to try and reduce or absolutely avoid some of the harms that can be caused through gambling to excess or out of control. And so you are seeing ministers on the Labour side who are proponents of more serious or more significant reform that perhaps has been proposed in the white paper. But as to its formal position on what the party as a whole would take should it actually enter into government, as you suggest, this may seem likely, that is still a bit of an unknown. You can make some sort of predictions or guesses as to what that might look like, but I wouldn't think that it's likely to be, a significant shift, particularly given the amount of work that's already gone into proposing something which is actually quite coherent and logical, as is in the white paper. I'm not sure that the Labour Party is likely to represent a sort of fundamental shift to the pursuit of that policy objective. Yeah, it might be, but I doubt it.
Okay, and Is there any date on when the election will be taking place? Now, this is a bit more on personal curiosity than anything else.
Well, I mean, look, we await eagerly in Britain as to when that's going to be, because obviously there's much said about the current government as to whether or not it still has the authority to continue governing, given all that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years. But the latest seems to indicate that it's not going to happen in the first half of this year. So autumn is likely when it's going to be.
Okay,
it might be as
September,
late as,
October.
Might be as late as September, October, even November. Because in November, if there's an election held that late, there's obviously the question mark around other elections that are happening in and around that time, notably in the US as well. But November, if I was a betting man, would be probably where I would guess it would take place.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for the heads up on that. So I'll ask this question. Brexit. We're what now? 4 or 5 years after the UK left the European Union. Yeah. What sort of impact has it had on the gaming sector in the UK, if any?
Gaming sector, I think it's less in terms of, how it has been for sort of UK consumers, but many of the businesses that we advise have been fundamentally impacted about how it is that they organise themselves to provide their services. So what we saw post Brexit, and particularly with the status of Gibraltar moving with the UK effectively outside of the European Union, and a lot of the big online UK facing online gambling operators having established themselves historically in Gibraltar, it did force them to reconsider where they needed to set up their operating hubs in order to continue supplying their services, both in the UK, but more pertinently throughout the European Union and indeed elsewhere. It's well known, obviously, in many jurisdictions throughout Europe, it's made a condition of obtaining a license and accessing the local market that the company that does so needs itself to be established within the European Union. And obviously that no longer was the case for those Gibraltar-based businesses. So what you saw was a shift towards either shift of their entire operating hub or a movement of certain of their business functions, or an establishment of another operating hub elsewhere in the EU, Malta being the obvious destination for that. So we saw that being a big shift. But as it concerns sort of UK-facing services and consumers, it's not been an enormous impact. As I say, on a point of consumption basis, the regulations are largely unaffected by the fact of Brexit.
Okay, you mentioned Gibraltar. If I may ask you this question, Gibraltar were, like Malta, recently grey-listed. But the news coming out in October by the FATF was that Gibraltar has done enough to come off that list, and it will be announced at the next, let's call it, executive big meeting of FATF happening in February.
Yeah.
2 questions. Did you see any notable impact on business in Gibraltar during this grey listing? Because, for example, the after effects on Malta after being grey listed was that banking became impossible for both gaming companies and employees of gaming companies. So have you seen anything either linked to banking or anything else?
Yeah,
I have 2 questions. So have you seen anything on those lines? Second question, which is actually a question I've been asked by a couple of people, is, so the intention was in October to remove them from the grey list. Why are we waiting till February? Especially because grey listing does cause certain issues, especially commercially and operationally. I don't know if you can jump into that, but I'm sure it's a pertinent question that needs to be asked right now.
It is. So in terms of the first question on the impact, I mean, we definitely saw that, as you've alluded to in Malta, the impact of the grey listing, certainly on your key stakeholder relationship, and banks being particularly the relevant one. We saw it sort of trigger a sort of, I don't know whether nervousness is the right say, but a withdrawal of their preparedness to support the sector to the extent that it still featured on the grey list. And I think there was a similar impact in Gibraltar, but I don't think it was as sort of keenly felt. And I don't really understand why. I do think there was an impact, but it wasn't certainly from my perspective, it wasn't as sort of keenly felt in Gibraltar, perhaps, as it might have been in Malta. And there may be reasons unknown to me for that. What I would say is it definitely did have an impact, and certainly businesses who weren't already established in Gibraltar or already supporting the sector would have taken that into consideration as to whether Gibraltar was a jurisdiction where they wanted to start to prepare to support, or indeed wanted to go and get licenses and start operating there. So I do think it has had an impact, but it might not be as significant as perhaps happened in Malta.
Okay.
As to why February and not October, your guess is kind of as good as mine on that. I don't know whether, I mean, obviously, on the back of grey listing, there is sort of ongoing sort of assurances given about the extent to which necessary changes have been made to bring the jurisdiction off the grey list. Part of what was pointed to was things like the effectiveness of supervision of the regulator there, about the conduct of its licensees, and the extent to which it is actually properly enforcing the laws and regulations that are imposed there. And you have seen, as often has happened, there being a reaction from regulators in terms of the sort of standards that they're prepared to enforce. And I certainly have seen that happen in Gibraltar in much the same ways we saw happen in Malta, and may happen elsewhere as well. But I don't know, to be quite honest with you, as to why it's February and not October, for example, to your question.
All right. Okay. So we have the last couple of minutes before we close off. UK market 2024. First off, ICE is coming up in a few weeks' time.
Yeah.
How big, how important is this last edition of ICE taking place in London for the market, for the British market especially? And how do you see the market evolving in 2024?
So ICE is always a, from my perspective, has always been an enormously significant event in the British gambling market. It's usually incredibly well attended by people from across the globe, and I expect this year's edition to be no different to that. In fact, it definitely feels like this one is going to be particularly well attended. I don't know whether that is because it's the sort of end of an era type conference, but the diaries are quickly filling up, and it feels like lots of people are going to be in town. So it has been a bit of an institution in Britain for a number of years, and this year is going to be no different, I suspect. It will be interesting to see what happens next year and when it moves, but I don't know whether what proposals there may well be to propose some sort of alternative in London. I know a lot of people like to come to the UK even in February when it's not quite as nice as it might be in other times of the year, but we shall see on that. And as to your sort of wider question, what can we expect for the industry generally? I mean, I think it's going to be I've sort of alluded to an evolution into a new era of sort of regulatory oversight. I think that is one thing that I think will start to bear its fruit, certainly for the large operators in 2024. But obviously, it's still, it's not an amazing prediction to say it's going to be ongoing sort of consultations, change. It's all change at the moment in the UK, and so I think it's going to be a busy year for really sort of lobbyists and indeed gambling companies to try and actually shape the future of what gambling regulation in the UK is going to look like. There's some really important changes that can, if done sort of in a way that is perhaps not what the government's intended, could have very significant impacts for the industry. The financial risk checks I've mentioned, obviously the ombudsman being introduced, these are things which can have sort of very significant impacts on the industry and potentially very significant unintended consequences. So I think there's some very important sort of policy objectives that are going to be pursued this year that I think will be keeping lots and lots of people very, very busy.
So thank you so much for joining us, Chris. Really appreciate that you accepted our invite. But before we end, I'd also like to take this opportunity to remind our viewers about SiGMA Eurasia, which will be taking place in Dubai between the 25th and the 27th of February. And I urge you, if you're interested in finding out more information about this event, to go to the sigma.world website and find out more about SiGMA Eurasia taking place between the 25th and the 27th of February in Dubai. Chris, thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks, Trev. Always a pleasure.